welcome to Codex, a history of video games. I'm Mike Coletta.
And I'm Tyler Osby.
And today we're doing part 2 of A Chocobo Named Desire. Tyler, take it away.
That's right. Chocobo Named Desire, a history of Final Fantasy in all of the Final Fantasy games. Okay, so first, but before we get started on what is going to be an episode entirely dedicated to Final Fantasy VII, because as I got started writing stuff about Final Fantasy VII, I just kept going and realized that was an episode in its own right. So before we get going on that, though, we have an email from Matt in Japan who says, Final Fantasy VII is my favorite game in the series, so he has a lot to say.
6. Final Fantasy 6.
6, yes, sorry. Final Fantasy 6 is his favorite game in the series. Buckle up, friends. We're going in. As Tyler said, the game has an ensemble cast where their individual backstories and personalities shine. Generally, though, Terra is seen as the game's main character. She's the first character you control, and the game's central conflict revolves around her origins. Moreover, the various spin-offs like Dissidia and Theatrhythm use her as the game's representative. One reason why the cast is so strong is because there are several points in the games where the party has to split off to complete different objectives in the story. There are also a few major events where you have to split the party into squads in like a tower defense style battle. Final Fantasy VI also features one of the most unique twists on the monk class in the form of Sabin. Sabin's special attacks are performed by inputting Street Fighter commands like back, forward, back, and quarter circle forward. One of these attacks, the suplex, involves Sabin picking up the enemy, jumping in the air, and slamming them on the ground. Side note, that sounds super awesome. The most famous instance of this is against a boss called the Phantom Train, which is a train that's possessed by ghosts. Sabin can literally suplex a train.
That should be the first selling point of this game.
Yeah,
you can suplex a train.
Final Fantasy VI, you flip the back of the box, it says, you can suplex a train. Oh, I'm in. I'll buy it.
Yeah. Give me, here's all of my money.
Continuing with what Matt has to say here. The game has what I consider to be the best music in the series, hashtag hot take. Thanks to Yaboy Nobuo Uematsu, each character has their own theme song and they're all instantly memorable. The opera scene is the standout track that invokes similar feelings that a certain scene from FF7 also invokes. A couple other things Final Fantasy VI introduced to the series is Magitech armor, which is magic-powered mech suits, and optional/missable party characters, including a Moogle named Mog and a Yeti. A quick aside regarding the PS1 versions of the older Final Fantasies is that while they do include cool CGI cutscenes for certain parts of the games, the load times between battles and when pulling up the menu screen are just long enough to be annoying. I personally recommend getting the Game Boy Advance versions instead if you're looking to check them out. End quote.
Thanks,
That's
Matt.
What Matt in Japan says. Thank you so much, Matt.
Gosh, Matt's the best. What would we do without Matt?
Yeah, our unofficial third podcast co-host.
Yeah. All right, you ready to do this?
Ready to do this. So, where we left wow, my words today. Where we last left off was with Final Fantasy VI. So while every Final Fantasy game has its fans, even 13, it's just me. I'm the only one who's a fan of Final Fantasy 13. The bulk of the fandom is divided into two camps. Those who think FF6 is the best, and these tend to be older folks who grew up with the Super Nintendo and the Nintendo games, and then those who think that Final Fantasy VII is the best, and these tend to be younger folks that grew up with PlayStation. As we heard from Matt earlier, he falls in the FF6 camp. I think it really depends on what you were introduced to first. If you played the NES and Super Nintendo games growing up, and the first Final Fantasy games you played were on those, then you're probably more likely to love the 2D magnum opus that is Final Fantasy VI. For those of us who had never heard of JRPGs back in the mid-90s, that's me, Final Fantasy VII would be the gateway to a whole new genre of games we hadn't even considered before then. So while I love all of those older Final Fantasy games, my Final Fantasy love really starts with 7. And that's why I'm so excited.
That's what we're here to talk about, is your Final Fantasy love, Tyler.
My particular Final Fantasy love.
Are you and Matt going to have like a Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy VII battle after this?
Yeah, definitely.
Nice.
I'm calling you out.
It's like an old like wrestling conflict. I'm calling. It's just a bunch of shouting at each other.
Next time I'm in Japan, I don't know why I said next time. I've never been to Japan. Or the next time you're in the United States, Matt, we're throwing down.
I feel like it would be fun to go to Japan with you and to visit Matt.
Yeah, that would be very, very fun.
Oh, if we do that, that's going to be a podcast. Okay, continue. Sorry.
All right. So what I want to do today is dedicate this whole episode to Final Fantasy VII, and I think we can get away with this because Final Fantasy VII is its own subseries, wonderfully known as the compilation of Final Fantasy, and it includes like a bunch of different games across a bunch of different platforms. So I kind of just want to stop here and just cover all of these right now, and then we'll move on to Final Fantasy 8, 9, 10, etc. Next week. So for Final Fantasy VII, the OG, the original game, the first in the start of the compilation of Final Fantasy, development began right after Final Fantasy VI was completed. Originally, they wanted to create another 2D game, possibly for the Super Nintendo or for the PlayStation, but ultimately they decided to shelve that work in favor of developing Chrono Trigger, which is another JRPG that didn't quite fit the Final Fantasy mold, but is still an awesome game and totally worth checking out, which I think I said in the last episode. Anyway, once Chrono Trigger was released, they went back to work on Final Fantasy VII in 1995, which made it a little bit more obvious to them that they needed to make the shift to 3D. At this point in time, the Nintendo 64 was still being kind of teased, and the PlayStation was just starting to make inroads with gaming. So it was kind of starting to become clear that the future of games was like 3D polygon-based games, but people weren't quite sure yet, especially developers who knew that their processes were going to have to change, and it was just going to be much more difficult to make a 3D game. So a lot of them were reluctant to do it at first, which I don't blame them for. But they decided to make Final Fantasy VII a 3D game. Up until this point, Final Fantasy was always like a Nintendo franchise with a few re-releases on home computer systems in Japan. So Final Fantasy was just synonymous with Nintendo. So it was just kind of assumed that the next Final Fantasy game would be on the N64. Maybe they would even call it Final Fantasy 64. That seems like a pretty good name for the first iteration of the franchise on the Nintendo 64. And then Square themselves, they didn't really confirm it, but they sort of pseudo-confirmed this. They showed a demo called Final Fantasy VI, the interactive CG demo, at a conference called SIGGRAPH, which is a huge acronym, SIGGRAPH, which is a conference that had been held every year since 1978 on computer-generated graphics. This is where the latest and greatest in CGI gets shown, and in 1995, the hype machine for Silicon Graphics and the Ultra 64, as it was known at the time, was in full swing. Remember, Silicon Graphics is the company that made the chip for the Nintendo 64, like that made it do all its cool 3D stuff.
Ooh.
So they showed this demo that was like basically like a battle from Final Fantasy VI, but in full 3D, and it looked like a Nintendo 64 game, basically. And everybody kind of assumed that this was like a precursor to the new Final Fantasy game. But later it was revealed that the demo itself, which is really just a small battle, took up 20 megabytes of space, which is about as big as a whole game would take up on Nintendo 64. And so the full game was certainly going to require several orders of magnitude more larger storage space. So Square would confirm it. Only the CD-ROM format could contain all of the awesomeness that was the future of the Final Fantasy series, and so they set their sights on the Sony PlayStation as their console of choice, because the Nintendo 64, it had the disk drive, but that still wasn't as big in capacity as the CD-ROMs that the PlayStation used. So Nintendo kind of got passed up for Final Fantasy during this generation because of their choice of sticking with cartridges, which I think has widely been agreed upon that was a poor decision.
Big mistake.
In my opinion. Big mistake. No loading times, though. Those cartridges, no loading times. This wouldn't be the first time that Square would build a tech demo to test something out and then not follow through on the implied promises that the audience has inferred from it, but we'll get to those later on. The decision to put the game on the PlayStation, though, was instrumental in helping this game create the following that it has today. Having all that storage space not only allowed for a huge world, but also for beautiful, detailed backgrounds to be possible. This game is also a pioneer in how it used pre-rendered CG cutscenes in its storytelling. There aren't a whole lot of the fully pre-rendered cutscenes, but there are some really cool ones. But what takes up most of the space, I think, in Final Fantasy VII is those pre-rendered backgrounds, because they're just like really high quality. Well, for the time, they're very high quality, just straight up images that a cartridge just wouldn't have had the space for. So, yeah.
Are you talking about like when you're on the world map?
Yeah, or when you're not so much the world map itself, but like when you're in a dungeon or when you're in a city or something like that. All those backgrounds are pre-rendered, and they take up a lot of storage space.
Beautiful details.
Indeed. So Final Fantasy VII was released in 1997 for the PlayStation, first in Japan in January, and then in September for North America. And then Europe finally got a Final Fantasy game. This one came out in October in Europe.
Good
so
for you,
finally
Europe.
got to see what all the fuss was about. Good for you, Europe.
I'm proud of you, Europe.
Japan would also receive an updated version called Final Fantasy VII International, which contained some of the extra content that wasn't in the original Final Fantasy VII release, as well as a lot of bug fixes. Square would kind of go on to do this with a lot of games. They would release it in Japan, then a little while later it would come out in North America and Europe, and it would have like slight additions or like little changes, and then they would release it again in Japan as the international version of the game, which would contain all of the things they made for regions outside of Japan.
So what you're telling me is if I live in Japan, I'm going to have to buy every video game I love twice?
Yeah, and if you're a Square fan, you're going to have to buy it 5 or 6 times. I have bought Final Fantasy VII so many times.
I'm actually going to play this game. It's not out on Xbox yet, right? That comes... the remake?
Oh, the remake, like the big remake comes out next year.
That's next year? Okay, I'm going to get that for
but
sure.
I do think Final Fantasy VII is on Xbox.
Oh, yeah, that came in...
Quick. Yeah.
Because they have it as like a... Is that a Game Pass game or no?
No.
That'd be so cool if it was, though. Oh, man, I'd lose my mind. Okay, continue. Sorry. I'm going to play this game, though. I'm just waiting for the right timing.
Yep, that's what it takes. You gotta get it at the right time. So Final Fantasy VII was also the first game released for Windows as well, coming to PCs in June of 1998, this time on 4 discs, and then I wrote the word earthquake because I live in Los Angeles and there was an earthquake a few days ago, right as I was typing that.
Oh, how are you? You okay? It was a pretty big one, right? It was a 6, a 5?
7.1.
7.1. Did stuff fall off your shelves?
No, I have a ukulele up on a shelf that kind of tipped over, but it didn't really fall. That's it. That's all that happened.
How are the animals? Were they okay with it?
They seemed to be just fine. Toby the cat, podcast producer Toby the cat, kind of ran down the hall a little bit, and then Luna the dog chased after him, but that was pretty much it.
They're just like, oh, it's rumble time. Fun.
Yeah. But it was a long one. It was like the longest one probably since I've moved here, when I've been here 5 or 6 years now. So, yeah.
Well, I'm glad you're okay. I was thinking about that, and I saw it, but I'm like, well, he hasn't texted me anything scary, so I think he's okay.
I would have texted you if I was dead.
I know. That's what I figured. That's what I assumed.
Yeah.
It's a spooky ghost text.
Anyway, earthquake happened while I was writing this stuff. The PC version of Final Fantasy VII features a lower quality soundtrack, I think because it's a MIDI soundtrack for PCs, which means you've got to have a pretty good sound card back in the day that had like realistic instruments, noises and stuff, and every sound card kind of sounded different from each other, like different brands stuff sounded different, so like the quality of a game's music could vary widely when it used this format. But most people agree that it's just not as good as the quality sounds of the PlayStation. And I think it's easy to look at the PlayStation and say, this is how it was meant to sound. Even if you had like a really high quality MIDI sound card or something like that, you could still feel like it wasn't the way it was meant to be heard. Anyway, it later would get re-released on PC with a lot of those issues fixed, plus modding support. So if there were any lingering issues, you could fix them yourself. The joys of PC gaming. Big fan.
Yeah, I know. So wait, when you say this is the first game that came out, it's not the first ever game that came out on Windows, is it?
Well, no. Sorry, the first Final Fantasy game that came out.
I was going to say that wouldn't work. But yeah, that's what I figured. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, the first in the series to.
That's still huge though. PC gamers getting that JRPG on. Now you can spend even more hours at your computer.
Yeah, and it was on 4 discs instead of the 3 discs of the PlayStation version. I'm not really sure why it was on 4 discs. Maybe it had some higher quality assets or something. I don't know.
Well, at this time, was it still like it is now, where PCs are better than everything if you upgrade them all the way? So they wanted to accommodate those people that had crazy good PCs? Is that what it was then?
In 1997, it was a little bit less that way because graphics cards were still kind of this like, maybe this is sort of optional on my gaming PC, whereas like the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64 definitely had 3D capabilities that not everybody's home computer had. So I think this was a period of time where that was maybe not entirely true, but I don't know.
Hey, you know what? You're the expert, and I believed it, and that sounds like a very good answer. So thank you, Tyler.
Well, thanks. Oh man, all this talk of Final Fantasy VII's development and release process, and we haven't even touched on the story, which is the best part. So, the main story of Final Fantasy VII, I want to try to avoid spoilers here a little bit because the game is getting remade and coming out in March of next year. So I'm going to tiptoe a little bit, but I'll give you the gist here. The main story of Final Fantasy VII follows a character called Cloud who has left the military and joined up with an eco-terrorism group called Avalanche. So right from the start, the character is put into the middle of everything. He even starts the game doing this cool flip jump from a moving train. Young me thought that was the coolest thing in the whole world. It's very iconic from that game. The story follows Cloud and their unlikely group of friends through a mission at the Shinra power plant where they blow up one of the power reactors. Shinra is this massive evil corporation. Wow, I cannot speak today. Shinra.
Do you think the earthquake shook up your vocal cords maybe a little bit?
I do. I think there's a chance that happened.
By the way, it's kind of bizarre, or not bizarre, but just looking back, they did a story about eco-terrorism in 1997. This seems like a game that would come out today.
Yeah.
With environmentalism.
Or next year in March.
That's true. You know what? You got me. I got zinged. Okay, keep going. Sorry.
Got him. Okay, so Shinra is an evil corporation that is using Mako or Mako. I think there's some debate as to how it's pronounced, Mako, to generate power. The only problem is Mako is basically the liquid form of the planet's essence, the life stream. Pretty much they're sucking the planet dry to give power to the world, and they're being super evil while they're doing it.
That's the worst.
I know, just the worst. So in the beginning of the game, you're going in there to blow up one of these power plants because you've got to stop them from being just the worst.
If you're going to suck the core out of the planet, you should at least be nice about it,
Yeah.
At least be friendly.
Yeah, at least pretend to be my friend, pretend like you're doing some good here, but they weren't. I don't think. I haven't played this game in a long time. Maybe they were less obviously evil at the time. I don't know. But in typical JRPG fashion, the main character has a form of amnesia that's keeping him from remembering his past super clearly, especially his time in the military. So we go on a journey to stop Shinra and find out about Cloud's dark and mysterious past. This is straight from the pages of the JRPG playbook. Although I think at this point in time, you could say that this is one of the games that really solidified that trope. It's like when people go back and watch Seinfeld now and they're like, oh, these jokes are not funny because they've been done a million times. It's yeah, well, Seinfeld did it first. Or
it was the first time.
It,
It was revolutionary.
Right. So maybe 7 is a little bit like that, where it was early enough that this wasn't a cliche yet. Anyway, so this isn't really a spoiler, I don't think, but the main baddie is a character named Sephiroth, who would go on to define a whole generation of edgelord teens who just want to be cool. He thinks that because of some experiments done on him, that he's basically a child of the Earth, and he wants to turn the whole Earth into a spaceship so he and his mom can ride through the cosmos together forever. He's kind of weird, which is very typical for a Final Fantasy villain. He's got this spiky white hair and a giant, long, thin sword that just looks so cool, and probably lots of people want to be Sephiroth. I was more of a Cloud person. I would rather be Cloud than Sephiroth, but Sephiroth's pretty badass.
I'm gonna play this game, and you know what? In March 2020, I'm gonna have an answer to that question for you. So just write that down. Just pen that down real quick for me.
All right, can't wait. The gameplay of Final Fantasy VII is similar to 6. The Esper system from 6 was iterated on in 7 in the form of the Materia system. So none of the characters have classes again, though they do kind of have some base stats, and that kind of suggests that maybe some of them are better than others at certain things. But players could mix and match Materia, which is a pure condensed form of Mako that powers the world, to give their characters various spells and abilities. So characters would level up, but so would the Materia separately, which was quite the grind for some of the better Materia. Once a particular Materia had been mastered, then it creates a new one that needs to be leveled up all the way from the bottom, like a baby Materia. So if you really liked a piece of Materia and you wanted to put it on all your characters, you could get new Materia that way by leveling up your Materia. It took a long time and was generally not worth it, but I'm sure a lot of people did it.
Just because they love the game so much. People do crazy things when they love a game.
That's true. That is true. The game also introduced to the series limit breaks, which were themselves kind of an evolution of the desperation attacks in Final Fantasy VI. So these moves were unique to each character and were super powerful ultimate abilities that could be cast after filling up a limit meter, which you filled up by hurting enemies, and there's a few other things that can happen. I think if you get hurt, it fills up your limit bar, stuff like that. So on the gameplay front, the game played it fairly safe by only iterating on the successful formula introduced in Final Fantasy IV and then iterated on in 5 and 6. And I think that approach worked out pretty well because we got this like really refined and fun system that the next few games were also able to iterate on. We wouldn't see a really large shift in this kind of stuff until maybe Final Fantasy X or X-2. But the 7 is a pretty good balance between a lot of these games. So I'm a big fan of the materia system. When it was released, Final Fantasy VII sold 2 million copies in Japan in just 3 days, which is massive. It didn't sell quite... Oh, sorry?
Especially for 1997.
Yeah.
That's huge.
I'm always impressed when a game sells like a whole bunch of copies in Japan because I'm like, in the US, there's like 300 million people, but Japan has significantly fewer people. So when a game sells better in Japan than it did in the US, I'm like, dang, people really like that game. Japan.
I'm going to look up the Japanese population in 1997 right now, just for you.
Great.
Here we go. It was, at 1997, it was 126 million.
Okay, so it was probably, what was the U.S. population?
The U.S. population around then was...
Probably a little less than half that. Well, Japan was a little less than half.
The U.S. population then was 272.9 million.
Okay.
So it's almost more than double.
Dang.
Dude, I'm looking at this chart right now that shows you how fast the population's grown, and it's pretty mind-blowing. Okay, sorry. Off topic. Keep going.
The game didn't sell quite that fast in the U.S., but at the time, you got to remember, North America was not huge on JRPGs, so it's not super surprising. It did pick up some steam, though, and overall, the game sold almost 10 million copies by 2005 worldwide, which is absolutely nuts if you ask me. It was definitely a system seller where people would just buy a PlayStation just to play Final Fantasy VII. That's how popular this game was. And it was also well received by critics, getting 9s and 10s all across the board. I remember the back of the box of Final Fantasy VII has a quote from Game Fan magazine, and it says, "Quite possibly the greatest game ever made." Dang.
That's amazing.
That's pretty good. So I got to agree, though, not too far off from the truth at the time. It also won a ton of Game of the Year awards from various publications. It did really well. People liked the game. Okay.
I'm going to start, when I talk about our podcast with people, I'm going to say it's quite possibly the greatest podcast ever made, and see how long I can push that for.
And just say it was Podcast Fan Magazine that said it.
Pod Fan Magazine.
Pod Fan Magazine.
In 1997, which is pretty crazy that we weren't even recording then, and they knew already.
They were looking ahead into the future, and they're like, quite possibly. But only possibly, not confirmed, just possibly.
Just possible. It's possible, but not impossible.
That's right. Unprobable, unlikely, but never impossible. That's what Luigi says in the Super Mario Brothers movie. Okay, so... the CG in Final Fantasy VII was so groundbreaking at the time that Square was able to form an animation group that our man Sakaguchi would take the reins on, and they developed a feature film called Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within. It was not a great movie, but the graphics were awesome for the time, and so I'm glad that they made it.
I remember this. So was that in the Final Fantasy VII universe, that movie? No,
it's just they just were able to use the same animation stuff that they used. They learned a lot from making the animations for Final Fantasy VII that they were able to form their own animation subgroup. I think it's safe to say that Final Fantasy VII was a bit of a watershed moment in gaming. If you were anybody at the time, you were playing Final Fantasy VII, unless you were a Nintendo fanboy, which were just as strong then as they have ever been. It was
so strong, Nintendo fanboys.
So strong, Nintendo fanboys, yeah. They didn't get to play Final Fantasy VII because it wasn't on Nintendo console. Oh, that's a bummer. Not until, I guess, the Switch would be the first Nintendo console that Final Fantasy VII would be available on.
Yeah, so have fun playing Mario Kart or any of those other fun games.
Yeah. Oh, what do you got over there? Ocarina of Time? Psh.
Get out of here.
Yeah. Final Fantasy VII also won the first Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences Interactive Achievement Award ever, which is pretty cool too.
That's an award I've been going for my whole life.
Yeah, well,
this is a goal of mine.
Just do what Final Fantasy VII did, and you'll get there. I believe.
Just make a clone of it.
Yeah, just release it as your own game.
Last Illusion 7, that's what I'll call it.
So that's pretty much all I've got on Final Fantasy VII, the game itself. But I did mention earlier that FF7 was its own sub-series, so let's talk about some of these other games. We got Before Crisis, Final Fantasy VII. This was a prequel released in 2004 in the form of a cell phone game, and it was only released in Japan. So this game takes place 6 years before the events of Final Fantasy VII, following a group of Shinra employees called the Turks. They're kind of a special ops group that goes around doing cool missions for the bad guys in FF7, but in Before Crisis, they're like the protagonists. They're kind of the good guys. Since it was a cell phone game, it was divided up into 24 episodes that the player had to pay a monthly fee to subscribe to.
On a cell phone game?
Yeah, in Japan only.
A subscription cell phone game. I mean, now that doesn't sound crazy, but back in the, what was this? You said it was 2004?
2004, yeah. So we're talking flip phones here.
Wow. I mean, that's, if you did that and you're in Japan right now and you're named Matt, high fives all around.
I think it was not quite as weird in Japan as it sounds like it is. I think this was a kind of popular way to release games, especially cell phone games, because like mobile gaming has been really big in a lot of countries outside of like North America and Europe. Way bigger than it is now. Like we sort of think about mobile games as these like, oh, they're bite-sized, like not a real gaming experience. But in Japan, they definitely are considered like a real gaming experience. So it wasn't that weird for a game to be a subscription fee. But anyway, it was a 2D RPG that was pretty well received as far as like cell phone games go. I've never played it because it was never released outside of Japan, but it looks like it was pretty fun. It had a materia system, and there was a feature in the game where you could take a photo with your camera on your phone, and it would give you materia based on the dominant color in the photo, which is pretty neat. Players could also connect with each other online and trade materia and do some other stuff, and they didn't shut it down until 2018. So I'd say 14 years is a pretty good run for a mobile game.
Wow.
Like
so
Before Crisis.
So would you play those episodes for like 14 years? Was there enough content there to do that?
Yeah, it was. I think it was. I'm kind of inferring a lot here, but I think it was a kind of a games as a service sort of deal too, where there was like new missions and stuff to do, or like new things to do a lot. Because like you could go online and trade materia and stuff like that. So like maybe they had some stuff to do all the time, or maybe they just left the servers up for a long time and nobody was actually playing the game. And then they looked at it in 2018 and they were like, "Hey, nobody's played this game in 4 years. Let's turn it off."
Or there's one guy who's been playing the game for 14 years, and that day it was ended, it was really sad for him. And I want to talk to that guy and be like, "How did you play the game for 14 years? That's bananas."
You play this game for that long? Nobody plays games for that long, except WoW players.
He just goes to that to like Pokemon Go, and his mind is totally blown. Just like, what? In my mind,
this was as good as cell phone games got.
Yeah, in my mind, he was just living in a bubble for 14 years. So,
okay, so that's Before Crisis, the cell phone game. The next game on the list, I do think it's kind of interesting how, so Final Fantasy VII was released in 1997, and then it didn't get any other games for like almost 10 years. And then they decided, you know what? We're going to make this its own series. So they made Before Crisis, and then they made one of my favorite PSP games, probably my second favorite PSP game, Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII. I'll tell you about my favorite PSP game in another history series that I'll probably do. But Crisis Core came out in Japan in September of 2007 and in North America in March of 2008 on the PSP. This game takes a different style and goes for a more like real-time action RPG system. So the player still levels up, but they introduced a system known as the Digital Mind Wave. It's kind of like a slot machine that sits up in the corner of the screen while you battle, and it gives you different buffs and attacks and limit breaks and stuff. It's also how the player levels up. So when the slot machine hits 777, Zack levels up. So it was a fun system, and it seems like there was a lot of luck involved, but I kind of get the feeling that maybe the Digital Mind Wave was kind of rigged, especially when it comes to leveling up. It seemed to give it to you fairly regularly. So I don't think it was like truly random. But it was really fun. It was like an interesting mechanic that I haven't really seen any other games do quite as well. But in the storyline of Crisis Core, you play as Zack Fair, who is kind of a minor character in Final Fantasy VII, who's really only seen in flashbacks because he is dead before the events of Final Fantasy VII. So you play as him, though, in this game, who's a soldier who's part of the military at the same time as Cloud, and he's kind of friends with Cloud. He's like a friend and a mentor to Cloud. There's a really cool story in this game that sheds some light on Cloud and what kind of character traits he has and why he has those traits. The ending is one of the most heart-wrenching endings I've ever seen in any video game. And it's like I was watching it on this like tiny PlayStation Portable screen, and I was like crying. It's very good, but it cleanly leads into the start of Final Fantasy VII, which I appreciate big time. You also get a lot of information on Sephiroth too. It makes him a little bit more sympathetic, but not too much more sympathetic. Like, he's definitely still a bad dude. You just understand his motivations a little bit better. This game sold nearly 3 million copies, which is pretty good for a PSP game. And it was pretty highly praised as one of the best PSP games to come out at the time, which I totally agree with. Like I said, it's my second favorite, so I highly recommend this game. And for those of you who own a legal copy of this game, you can play it in an emulator, and it plays very well. And also, you can like bump the graphics up a little bit and stuff, which I recommend doing. Love this game.
Oh, by the way, I love games that, like, especially a spinoff. Like, that's exactly what I want a spinoff to do. Like, explain more about a character. So that you're saying, like, Sephiroth, that's perfect. It, like, again, just gives you enough more information that he's still a villain, but you understand him more. That seems like a great idea. You know, more games should do that, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I really like this game, so I recommend playing it. The next game on our list of compilation of Final Fantasy VII games is a game called Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII. So I haven't played Before Crisis, but I have a feeling that Dirge of Cerberus is probably the worst game in the Final Fantasy VII subseries. So it was released it was released in January of 2006 in Japan, and then later that August in North America. It's a third-person shooter with some RPG elements.
Okay, that's very weird. That just feels very weird for Final Fantasy for me.
It feels weird for Final Fantasy. It feels a little less weird when you take into account who the main character of this game is, which is Vincent Valentine, who is a character who is optional in the course of the story in Final Fantasy VII. Seven has two optional characters in it. Vincent Valentine, who's this kind of like brooding, badass type of character who is sort of similar to like Cloud or Sephiroth in that way. But he's been around for a while. The other optional character is Yuffie, who's like a ninja person who also steals things and is one of my favorite characters in the whole game. But Vincent Valentine, his storyline here, just to give you a little bit of backstory on him, he was a witness to Sephiroth's birth and also had some experiments done on him, which makes him unable to age. He's a pretty popular character with fans, so bringing him back in his own game makes total sense. This also makes sense as a third-person shooter because he is a character that uses a gun in the game. And so making his game about him where he shoots stuff makes a lot of sense to me.
Okay, you know what? You sold me. You sold me on the shooter.
Well, don't get too excited because that doesn't mean the game is good.
Okay,
you can pick from three.
I'm not sold. I'm not sold anymore. I retract being sold. I'm no longer sold.
I have bought it back from you. You've returned this game to me.
Full refund.
Full refund. So this is a third-person shooter where you can pick from 3 different kinds of guns, each with their own levels of customization. So you can get like different barrels and stuff for them. After each level of shooting bad guys, you get experience, and you can spend that to level up, or you can spend it on other upgrades. It's also got a materia system that gives Vincent some magic powers, just like in the main Final Fantasy game, which is kind of cool. The storyline follows our boy Vincent 3 years after the events of Final Fantasy VII. He's being pursued by a group called Deep Ground, which is some new kind of Shinra unit created for enhanced super soldiers. We've been there, done that. It's more Shinra baddies. They want to awaken some kind of ancient monster or something like that, and Vincent's got to stop him. I played this game a little bit, and so it didn't really stand out to me in any way. And I say that as a person who is a fan of both Final Fantasy VII and a fan of shooters, especially shooters with RPG elements. I mean, we talk about Destiny every week on this show.
That's true.
I didn't really like this game when I played it back in the day, but now that I'm thinking about it again, I kind of want to try it again, and maybe it seems kind of neat. So maybe I'll go back and play this one again. It sold well, but it didn't do too well with critics. Fun fact, this is one of the few games on the PlayStation 2 that has mouse and keyboard support. So if you're a person who prefers that kind of style of gaming, which is me, you can do that with Dirge of Cerberus. So maybe I'll play it with a mouse and keyboard and see how that feels.
Is there a PC port of it? It's got to be, right?
Nope.
Wow.
This is a PS2 exclusive.
Wow, that's nuts.
Yeah. So, okay. So at this point, we're kind of done with the games. There may be a few other like smaller spinoffs that I haven't really touched on here. But I do want to talk about one other addition to the compilation of Final Fantasy VII that's not a game, but it is a movie. And it's like a true sequel. It's really the only true sequel to Final Fantasy VII. So Advent Children came out in 2005. And even though that first Final Fantasy movie, Spirits Within, didn't do so well, Square decided to give it another shot with this direct-to-DVD sequel of the most popular Final Fantasy game. They upped their CG game pretty significantly here, and all their experience from the first movie and making the CGs for Final Fantasy VII through, must have been 10-2 at this point, went into making Advent Children. And I think the graphics still hold up pretty well today. It looks a little dated, but it doesn't look too bad. So Advent Children takes place 2 years after the events of Final Fantasy VII. Things are starting to be rebuilt a bit, but there is a problem. People, including Cloud and especially children, are starting to come down with a mysterious illness called geostigma. There are also 3 other people who are kind of like a physical representation of Sephiroth after his death, and they're trying to bring him back by gathering all these kids because they think that the geostigma is because these kids have like pieces of Sephiroth in their blood or something like that. And so, of course, it's up to Cloud and the crew to bring down and defeat the bad guys. This movie has a lot of fan service in it. So while I remember liking it a lot when I was 15, it did receive kind of some mixed reviews from critics. But looking back on those reviews, I think the negative ones tend to come from people who weren't really fans of the game, so they didn't really know what was going on in the movie. If you're a Final Fantasy VII fan, it's worth checking the movie out because it's got some great CG, some great action sequence, even if the story could be a little more coherent. Plus, it's under 2 hours long, so you're really not risking a whole lot by choosing to check this game out.
Yeah. I think it's cool they did a movie, though.
Yeah, it's neat. It's got some really cool fight scenes in it, and I like it. I think the music is really good. It's very anime. It's like it's a CG movie, but it is definitely made in like the anime style of like storytelling and stuff. So if you're not really a fan of anime, this is kind of just a CG anime. So maybe you wouldn't like it.
You know what? I'm glad you included it though, Tyler. I think it's important.
Yeah, me too. So that's kind of where we leave it with Final Fantasy VII here. I want to talk about the legacy for a bit here. This is a game that left a huge impact on the industry. It popularized the JRPG in the West and delivered a narrative-driven experience that a lot of gamers hadn't ever really had, especially out here in the West. The game itself was pretty groundbreaking at the time, especially with its CG cutscenes. And though the pre-rendered backgrounds were pretty great, the rest of the game had kind of low visual quality in my experience, or in my opinion, by comparison. I mean, if you just look at Cloud's hands, they're like squares. They look like hoofs. Like, That's not even an exaggeration.
I remember we talked about that one time. I was like, it does look like his hoof hands.
That's not an exaggeration. They're just cubes.
What if they win the remake, it really is hooves, and this whole time he's had hoof hands, and they just didn't say anything, and now that they've redone the game, you know for a fact he has hoof hands.
Well, I guess we'll see, won't we?
Is it hooves or hoofs? Hoof?
Hooves? I think you can say it either way.
I think so too. It's like a tomato situation. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, they didn't look great. The battle scenes in Final Fantasy VII look much better, but the out of battle just is not the best. Final Fantasy VIII would look much better by comparison. But what I think is interesting here is that Square saw that they had a winner, and at least a few years later, after Final Fantasy VII was so popular, they started the first sub-series of Final Fantasy games with the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. This approach would later go on to inspire the Fabula Nova Crystallis, which is a similar compilation of games all built around Final Fantasy XIII. And the fight scenes in Advent Children inspired the battle system for Final Fantasy XIII. One of their goals when they were making 13 was to make a battle system that looked like you were playing Advent Children, which I think is a pretty worthy goal to go for, since the fight scenes in Advent Children are pretty sweet, and I really like the battle system in Final Fantasy XIII, but we'll get there in a future episode. They're not done yet, though. In 2015, Square announced that they were going to make a full-fledged remake of Final Fantasy VII to be released in March 2020. The remake looks super sweet, but only time will tell if it will live up to the legend. They're big shoes to fill, but I'm an optimistic person. I think they can do it.
Yeah, do you think, like, if they just redo the graphics but leave the whole systems as it was, it would be good to you? Like, would you like that?
I think that would be fun, and I would definitely play it, but that's not what they're doing. They're redoing the whole thing. All the battle systems are different and everything. Like, I'm super excited for that.
That's kind of... So they're making it more like newer Final Fantasy game battle systems?
Yeah, it feels like it's more like Crisis Core, but then also Final Fantasy 15 is in there too. You can definitely see it. Like, there's some gameplay videos up online. They had a playable demo at E3, which I would have waited in line for if I knew it was there. But then by the time I found out about it, I was too late.
I imagine the line for that demo would have been pretty nuts too.
Yeah. So
maybe you saved some time, saved your life, a little time,
maybe.
you know?
But that's Final Fantasy VII and all of the games that go along with it. So that's pretty cool. What have you been playing, Mike?
Well, it's been kind of a slow week for me because I've had a lot of life stuff going on. What? Real life stuff? I know. It's super lame.
No.
It's super lame. But Apex Season 2 came out, and they made a lot of fixes, and they added this ranked mode, and that's the game I primarily play with friends now, and it's so much better. Like, it's really nice.
That's good.
So, yeah, because everyone's trying to be sweaty in ranked mode, and I don't really care about being sweaty, so I just play social still, and it's all people that are playing on my skill level, and it feels nice. And sometimes I have games where I look really cool, and then sometimes I have games where I look like a scrub, and I enjoy it that way, you know? And they've also added it so the new Battle Pass, it's not impossible to achieve. Like, all the challenges are based on things you do in the game versus just playtime. So it's like some of them are a little weird. Like some of them, we've talked about this with Destiny before, where they make you play the game differently, which I think is not okay. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of people are thirsting now for kills because a lot of the challenges involve getting finishers on certain characters. So everyone's trying to thirst. Like everyone's just trying to get their finisher, you know, so they get the 3,000 points or whatever. And in that way, it's kind of silly, but I think they're going in the right direction. You know, it's going to be like one of those things where maybe by season 3, they kind of figure it out fully. And it's definitely an experiment. And ranked mode is interesting too, where you gain points to be in matches and you also use those points to play in higher level matches. So bronze is free, but silver costs one. So if you go to silver and you keep getting your butt kicked, you'll just eventually lose your points and you'll go down to bronze again, it's not like demotion. It's like you just can't afford to play in silver.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I think it's pretty cool. So we'll see how that goes. It's still super early. My friends and I are waiting like 2 weeks, and then we're going to play ranked mode again after all the people that are like crazy good move up away from us, you know?
Yeah, that's a good way to do it.
I saw a guy with 30,000 kills today.
Whoa. I think I have like
2,000. Isn't that crazy?
That is incredible.
Yeah, I was like blown away. I'm like, have you just played this game for the last entire like 2 months it's been out? Is this all you've been doing? Like, I have no idea how you can pull that off. It's so insane. My friends are like, he's got to be cheating. And I'm like, well, you know, or he could be the kind of guy that just plays this game all the time. So it's been longer than 2 months, hasn't it? It's been like 5 or 6 months the game's been out. So
yeah, I think it came out in like February. So
yeah, so it's still it's reasonable. Well, not reasonable, but still like it's possible. But I've been playing that, and then my girlfriend and I are playing a lot more Harry Potter because she found the park that has like 8 of the inns in it, so I get energy all the time, and we just go walk around that, and it's been really fun. And the cool thing about the Harry Potter game is the energy thing kind of sucks sometimes, but there's story to it. Like as you go and unlock stuff, you hear more about why you're playing the game. And
that's
like,
cool.
Yeah. So for a Harry Potter nerd like me and my girlfriend, this is a great game. It's really fun. And we're like getting story stuff along the way. And I caught a unicorn. So living the dream.
That's pretty great.
Yeah. So it's really fun. I recommend it to anyone who likes Harry Potter. And you can kind of play it like super hardcore, or you can play it super casual. We kind of just go walk around her park like 3 times a week and play it, and that's the way to do it, I think, just to have fun, you know, as a way to just hang out. So I haven't really been playing a lot of new games though. I want to play Outer Wilds. I just haven't had time to get started, and I like when I start a new game to have at least 2 hours to play it, and my schedule's been such that I haven't had that. I haven't even played a lot of Destiny this week really either.
Oh, that's a bummer.
It's a huge shame. But what have you been playing, Tyler?
Well, opposite of you, I have been playing a lot of Destiny. I did a whole bunch of like power leveling stuff to get to 750 this week. So now I'm 750 and I can feel like I can conquer the world.
Do you feel like you're a better guardian than me now? Because you should.
Yes, I do.
That's good. That's good. You feel like I'm a kindergarten, don't you? You look at me.
That's exactly how I feel. Yep.
Yeah. Oh man, Tyler's in 1st grade and I'm a kindergarten, and it hurts.
I have my own desk and I eat lunch at school.
Oh man, I only can do a half day because I got to go home.
Yep. So that's pretty much it. That's what I spent most of this long weekend playing. And then also watching my girlfriend play Red Dead Redemption 2. So she's getting pretty far into that game.
How far into it is she now? Where's she at?
The percentage meter says about 34%. I can't tell you where she's at in the story because I haven't been paying close enough attention to really be following the story.
Okay, because it's deceptive. I mean, you start going through these acts, and it's like some of the acts are longer than others, so it's like deceptive. Yeah. You know, it's like, oh, I'm in Act 4. I'm really like far in the game. Some of those acts take a little while. So
yeah, she's got a really long beard now. Arthur Morgan.
You know
has
what?
Not shaved him at all, and so he's got a pretty gnarly beard.
That's
at this point.
the most important part of the game. That's what all of my friends and I tried to do, was just use those hair tonics all the time. It's important. Yep. It's the mini game. It's the meta. Is the is the beard. Well, I'm glad. Glad it's fun.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I haven't played. I need to go back and play to pick up World of Final Fantasy. I need to keep playing Prey, but I just haven't this past week. So Prey is a game that I kind of want to play like at night with the lights off a little bit. Like I just really want to get immersed, and I just haven't had the opportunity to do that yet.
That's important. But you got to get immersed, you know?
Yep. I've been reading lots of Spider-Man comics, and I saw Spider-Man Far From Home last night, which I loved. It was great. I'm a big Spider-Man fan, so I recommend it. It's getting great reviews. I don't think my opinion is controversial, but I highly recommend it.
Nice. Well, I want to let people know, as always, you can email us at codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also rate and review and subscribe to us on Spotify. We're on there now. I see downloads from that.
All right.
Yeah, we're also on Apple Podcasts. Whatever you want to do, we would really be helpful. And also just tell your friends. That's the most important thing. If you don't want to do the review, just be like, hey, there's a video game podcast to listen to, and it's pretty neat. And then you can tell your friends, and then maybe they'll like it and listen to it, and then they'll tell their friends, and it'll just be a snowball of video game history podcast.
If you tell 5 of your friends, and then they tell 5 of their friends,
that's 25.
A lot of friends.
That's 25 friends, according to
You'll
multiplication.
Be at the top of the pyramid.
You will.
You don't get anything from being at the top of the pyramid except our eternal and undying love.
That's true, and that's worth a lot, I think.
Sure is.
So you can do that. You can find me on Twitter at @mecoletta. You can find Tyler on Twitter, SneakerElf, ELPH. He's there. And other than that, thank you so much. This was a great time. I had a great time. I want to play this game so bad, and I'm waiting for that March 2020, and it's going to be a great time.
Yep.
So
I can't wait. I'm going to take time off work probably.
I should take time off my hypothetical work too. Okay? And then we can just talk on the phone all day while playing the game. Feel like we're in the same room. Oh, it'll be perfect. Okay. Well, thank you so much for listening, everybody, and have a great time being a person this week. That was a failed goodbye, but that's okay.
Have a great time being a person this week. Bye-bye.
Bye.